I spoke to two former Whitehall insiders about how the Brexit negotiations have been handled by Britain's politicians and civil servants. Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff to Tony Blair in Downing Street and was intimately involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. Jill Rutter, who now works at the Institute of Government, has previously worked at the Treasury and No.10. Jonathan Powell, you have written a furious article, really. I mean, not just about criticising politicians, but really saying Britain has failed in a very fundamental way. Just explain why you think politics has so catastrophically failed.
I think Britain's failed, but the British political class have failed. Most of my work nowadays is abroad, working on conflicts around the world, civil wars. And when I go there and talk to people, they'll talk about their civil war for half an hour, and they turn to me and say, what on earth's happened to Britain? You used to be the cradle of democracy, you used to be the most effective system. You've collapsed. What's happened? And it gives some sense of perspective. People in real civil wars feeling sorry for us about our division. The system has failed.
But is this just somebody who used to be in power saying, oh, it's not as good as it used to be?
I'd like to think it's not. I would take my share of the blame for what's happened. I'm part of the political class. I was a civil servant for 14 years and then a political appointee for 13 years. So I take my part of the blame. There is no doubt that the political class has failed, and we're in a very serious moment. It's not just about Brexit, and it won't be cured by Brexit going away.
Jill Rutter, how fundamental do you think the failure politically has been?
Big thing I think has been, on Brexit particularly, has been the absolute failure of our system to make decisions. So if you look at the Cabinet is supposed to be able to decide things and come to a realistic way forward. But what we've seen basically since the referendum is a complete paralysis of that normal decision-making process. So it was only in July last year that the Cabinet finally came out with its sort of detailed position about what the UK wanted out of its future relationship. And the trouble for the Prime Minister is that was such a sort of carefully concocted compromise that it was the UK's initial position, but she couldn't move from it. So, and that was a failure to recognise the position we were in. And I think one of the things Jonathan brings out very strongly in his article is a failure to sort of really grasp that you have to encounter reality. You can't make policy in a vacuum. You can't make policy just to keep your party together. You actually have to look at the other side, look at what's going on out there on the ground, and not just be in a lot of denial.
So to what extent do you think the contempt a lot of people hold for party politicians right now is justified?
I think
because reading Jonathan's article, I mean, it is.
It's not a very good look. I mean, I think there's some interesting things. I mean, I think we've seen the emergence of some really quite interesting politicians. We've seen a really interesting shift of power to the backbenchers. I think a lot of select committee chairmen are actually easier to remember who they are than front bench spokespeople. But clearly, neither of our major political parties is managing to come out of Brexit looking good, looking coherent. And that's really because Brexit is such a different problem for them. Because Brexit is not an issue that divides on the normal left-right split. It divides both parties enormously. Neither wants to split the party, so they're both walking tightropes of how far can they go to have a coherent position that doesn't split their party, and we end up with quite incoherent positions.
I mean, you're being quite kind. I mean, Jonathan, you also criticise the civil service and say they should be standing up more to point things out that are wrong.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I make it very clear, I don't blame the civil service for what's happened. It is the failure of the government and the failure of the opposition, which neither opposes nor is any way competent or a competent alternative government. But I think the civil service has made two mistakes. One is its inability to carry the weight when government fails like this. If you think of the 1970s, when we had revolving door governments, we had constant political crisis, the era of yes minister, then the civil service provided the continuity when government failed. This time it's not doing it. The second thing it's not doing is it's not telling the Prime Minister when she is chasing unicorns. They really should have told her at the beginning what Europe would accept and what Europe wouldn't accept. It wasn't a mystery. I would know what they would accept and what they wouldn't accept.
Like yesterday, you mean?
Yes, exactly. Why do they not tell her? There is no way the backstop is going to be subject to a time limit. It cannot be, because it's not a backstop. She knows that, but she united her party for one day to do that.
What has happened?
I think it's really interesting, and I think this is where I think Jonathan and Tony Blair do have to pick up a bit of the blame, because I think one of the effects of those 13 years of Labour government is the civil service really lost confidence about its role as the principal policy advisor, and there was a very big shift.
Because it was being bossed around by special
ministers
advisors.
Made it very clear that actually they saw their primary source of advice on policy within government was their special advisor, the people they brought in from outside, and they really weren't that interested in the civil services policy advice. Instead, the civil service was relegated, if you like, to an execution role.
Jonathan Powell, if the two-party system is not working, is failing so fundamentally, what is the answer? I mean, it sounds as if you're laying the groundwork for a new type of political movement.
Well, what I suggest at the end of the article is that if we had had a collapse of the government and a collapse of the opposition, and if there haven't been this rising up of new political talent of the form that Churchill provided in 1939 to provide an alternative leader, then maybe what we actually want is a government of national unity, just as in dealing with the Second World War, when Churchill and Attlee came together to govern the country in the national interest after a crisis. Maybe that's what we need to build on.
Who could lead that?
Well, we need to give someone a chance to actually come and do it, but certainly not the two current leaders.
Can you see that as a possibility with this crop?
It's quite difficult because I think one of the things we saw yesterday was that party loyalties still run quite deep. I think it's really, really interesting. If the Prime Minister's attempt to go off to Brussels and renegotiate is as unsuccessful as I think Jonathan expects it will be, and Parliament has to come and confront this again on the 14th of February, what does that do? Does that really start to sort of shatter some of those party loyalties and see these sort of nascent groupings really, really coming together?